Can you explain for the committee how both of your groups are founded and who you represent and what, if anything, differentiates you?
Well, we were both founded in 2010 and we represent action groups up and down the line. There's over 100 action groups. We also work with parish councils, residents associations and other levels of council as well. HS2 Action Alliance were formed first, and basically they concentrate more on the academic side of the argument, whereas Stop HS2 is a grassroots campaigning organisation. And back in 2010, I suppose the roles were clearly defined, but there's been obviously a little bit of blurring since then as time's gone on, and we've both done more of the same stuff.
HS2 AA, as Joe said, was founded in 2010. We've got about 120 affiliated groups, and we've got 15,000 individual members. Our approach is quite coloured by who our directors are, so we tend to be pretty evidence-based in how we approach things, and we're very much focused on the economic and environmental cases, compensation, and making legal challenges.
So can I just ask you whether, in principle, you support infrastructure investment in transport to improve connectivity and to help boost the economy?
Well, absolutely. We've been advocating right since the start that HS2 is the wrong investment and there are better investments that would deliver more benefits to more people more quickly and cost less money. You know, this isn't a Luddite argument, despite what previous Secretaries of State for Transport have said. We fully support the idea that you need to invest in the country's infrastructure, but HS2 is the wrong investment at the wrong time and has unproven benefits, has a poor business case, is massively environmentally damaging, and there are just so many reasons pointing to other transport investments which cost less money.
Yes, the only thing I'd add to that is that I personally work as a management consultant in the railway sector, and professionally are concerned with improving infrastructure.
Thank you. Baroness Blackstone.
In the written evidence that you submitted to us, you said you were pretty unhappy about the values placed on time savings in the strategic case that you made. Could you tell us a bit more about that and what you'd like the Department of Transport to do instead of what they've done so far?
Yes, I think our real problem with the government's approach on valuing time is it doesn't really pass the test of common sense. Very early on, we made two criticisms of how they were handling value of time. The first was that if you were really going to have a very large increase in the number of business travellers, it wasn't believable that they would all come from the same very elite earning sector that they had from their 2000 sample of rail travellers. The second point we made was that mobile technology has been revolutionising the usefulness of the time you spend on trains. And this seemed to us to have an inevitable consequence that you can't attribute the same value to reducing time that is useful to time that isn't useful. And basically, we made these 2 points and we've been pressing for them to be addressed. Now, the first was actually addressed in the October 2013 business case, where they rebased their earnings data to the 2010 survey, so 10 years later, and lo and behold, that actually reduced the unit value of time by a third. The second point, that people are working on trains, and for that matter leisure people are finding the time they're spending on trains much more enjoyable and useful, that point basically has not been addressed. There is no reduction in the value of time to reflect the fact that the time is more useful. So a saving of that time, logically, must be worth less to individuals and businesses. And I think that's actually a very important point, because quite a lot which has been said about this sort of indicates the contrary and sort of blurs this third reduction, because they've rebased the point of their calculations to it actually being something to do with the more useful value of time. it isn't. Now, our view of how you put this right is essentially the government has moved from saying we're looking at the value of the time to businesses to we're looking at what they're willing to pay for it. Now, it's a clever move in some senses, but unfortunately they don't have any evidence that says that businesses are actually prepared to pay the same to reduce a piece of productive time as unproductive time, which is what their approach implies. And I'd be very surprised if you could conduct surveys that did show that, because you'd be pretty irrational to hold that view. But I would say that in the absence of actually having any direct evidence that this position is right, they ought to be taking the line that they radically reduce the value of on-board business time savings and leisure time savings until and if they ever get evidence that shows this. And I think that's it's not a trivial change to the business case, because so much of the benefits are actually dependent on this single parameter, which is the value of the time it saves, which is predominantly value on board the trains, which is affected by this issue. So it's really quite crucial. And personally, I've always been a bit shocked that they're prepared to contemplate a £50 billion investment while not actually having anything very solid to back the major benefit that this is supposed to deliver.
I'm sure you're right that it is common sense that not all time on trains is wasted. But the problem is that common sense won't tell you how to assess at least some of that time that's spent on trains, and the willingness to pay route is one that is used in cost-benefit analysis normally. So if you don't like that answer, what is the alternative? How can the Department of Transport do this?
I don't have any difficulty with using a willingness to pay basis. It's just you need some actual evidence to base it on. It seems to me wrong that you just say, look, we used to do the sums on the basis of the value of the time that was being wasted being cut. We're not doing that anymore because we accept the time's being spent usefully. So we're doing it on willingness to pay basis. But they can't point to any surveys which show that businesses are actually prepared to pay the same single unit cost that they would have paid for wasted time for a reduction in the time people spend on trains. It's not that I'm against a willingness to pay basis. I just say you can't adopt it if you don't have any proper evidence to base it on.
I think one of the problems is that the department and HS2 Ltd are exceptionally selective in the figures and the methodology that they use, and they don't like comparing like with like. And that's a theme that goes through the case for HS2 like Blackwall up through a stick of rock. Now, they've moved to this willingness to pay model, and which was devised by the Institute of Transport Studies at Leeds, without actually paying any attention to what that report specifically said. For example, quoting directly from the Leeds report, the willingness to pay approach does not, to the best of our knowledge, form the basis of any official national guidance in any country. And whichever approach the department adopts, the values derived need to be fit for purpose, appropriately robust, applicable for the appraisal to the appraisal cases for which they are used, and capable of being updated over time. Now, the problem is, for example, on the value of time, and basically willingness to pay has simply been a rebranding of value of time, because it still relies on value of time. And I think that HS2 Ltd were nudged by the Public Accounts Committee, who were very critical of this, and when HS2 Ltd came back to the second time to the Public Accounts Committee, they were quite critical that they still hadn't done anything. But if just on the case of looking at like with like, HS2 Ltd assume that the value of time of people increases by 2% for the next 80 odd years till 1992. However, they don't have that same assumption in their costs. So what you're seeing is an inflation of the benefits of HS2, but a completely ignoring the same effects on the costs. And that sort of approach is standard throughout the case for HS2. And again, with willingness to pay, the ridiculous thing is that they're saying that people will be willing to pay for quicker journeys, but base it on the idea that the cost of tickets will be exactly the same as the current ones. So if you're saying currently it costs, it takes 1 hour 25 to get from Birmingham to London on the Virgin train on the West Coast Main Line, and HS2 is going to come along and it's going to be 49 minutes, and they're both going to be the same price, well, of course you're going to choose the quicker one unless you actually want, to spend longer on the train for whatever reason. And this is the other problem. The other thing is that if you look at the Institute for Transport Studies model, the Department for Transport have actually hit out at HS2 Action Alliance for using a different definition of what consists of a long-distance journey. HS2 Action Alliance have used the actual figures from the train operating companies and what's consists of a long-distance journey there. HS2 Ltd decide to use any journey over 100 miles. But the Institute for Transport Studies, in their willingness to pay model, say that a long-distance journey is any journey taking over 2.5 hours. So it's completely incredulous to use that model because it doesn't take 2.5 hours to get to Manchester or Birmingham or somewhere between Nottingham and Leeds. And it's this idea that they keep trying to compare apples with oranges throughout the piece that completely undermines their case. And the other thing I should add as well, in terms of willingness to pay, because it's one of the anecdotes that we keep coming up with, is of course that the entire basis is on the idea that business users will want to use trains more and more in the future. Now, 3 years ago, Arup, who at that point had been given every single outside contract related to HS2, had told all their employees, do not travel for meetings, use video conferencing instead. And that's a problem, that they don't understand that the imperative of business will change, and it will be a generational change. But the imperative of business will be not to travel because it will represent a cost saving and potentially more efficient time in the future. It will simply become industry standard.
If I can just add a point to Joe's there. In fact, the Department for Transport aren't contesting that travel for business purposes is not growing.
Lord Banks.
Well, I was going to come on to that in terms of to quiz you about passenger demand and the way that bit of the argument has been going, because you made that point that in fact the passenger demand has not been going up, and in reply the department have made the point that demand for rail has been going up. Now, some of this is addressed in your supplementary evidence, which we've had in the last day or two. But how do you see that? I mean, I've worked with employers and companies before who, when they've hit a bad patch, have banned all business travel, and that's lasted about 6 months, and then it's gone back to normal. And business travel has, despite what Arup have done, by rail has gone up, according to the department. Now, you've got some comments on that. I wonder if you could share those with the committee.
Absolutely. Basically, I'd like to kick off by saying I don't have a crystal ball which tells me what the future of transport demand is going to be. What I would say is that there's plenty of evidence that the experts frequently get it wrong, and in particular they get it wrong in the context of large projects. And basically, Department for Transport themselves don't have a spotless record on this with HS1. The problem is that if you've got a good short-term forecasting model and you push it, it keeps on telling you that the trends you've got now go on forever. And I think that it really requires that you put that picture into context. And the essential context, the way we look at it, is if you actually look at the amount of domestic travel people do, per person, over the last nearly 20 years, that has not changed. If you look at the number of long-distance journeys they've made, it's been persistently at and around 7. There's no trend in it. It's not increasing. So you've got an overall context of domestic travel per person not going up as we've become more affluent, because we've got a lot more affluent over that period. Okay, it's been ups and downs, but generally we've got a lot more affluent, but people per person actually are not travelling more. So, essential context. You then look at rail by itself. Okay, rail undeniably has increased a great deal from about 1995. Okay, if you go further back than that, if you go back to the Second World War from there, the total demand is pretty well flat, and it lost market share throughout that period. But if you might say in the modern era, from 1995, it's had a lot of growth. But the obvious question, when you're looking at this in the context of no growth overall, is there something special about rail? And if there is something special about rail, is it going to keep going in the way it has? Can we safely predict it's just going to go on as it has recently forever? Now, we say actually there's quite a few reasons to think that sort of approach is a bit incautious. It might be right, but there's a pretty good chance it's going to be wrong. First of all, there's basically, we think there's 4 reasons. There's special factors. First, there's special factors about the value of increasing value of onboard time, the increased subsidy we had when we privatised the railway, the fact that we've had some new ideas in how you do pricing, so you have airline pricing. Second, the model that you actually use to produce all this growth is essentially a short-term forecasting model. It's very heavily used for predicting revenues for rail franchises and that sort of thing. It's been constantly modified to keep it on track for that sort of purpose. But it is essentially a short-term model. Back in 2006, the review of the transport needs of the country commented on the forecasting model, which is a couple of generations back, but essentially the same forecasting model, that because of the way it worked, it wouldn't produce reliable forecasts over about 10 years. Now, we're looking at forecasting before we reach a point of saturation, or the cap that they use, of 23 years. So we're really pushing what you can do with that sort of model pretty hard. And what it's assuming are things like not only things go up with population, but there's a relationship with economic growth, so that it goes up with the real incomes. It doesn't have anything about the usefulness of time, which is actually quite important, because while it's pushing rail up now, if you have something like Google Cars, it's not going to push it up anymore. In fact, it could reverse. If people found they could work and do what they wanted as the car whisked them along to wherever they wanted to go, the trends that we've been looking at are going to get a reversal. Now, I can't say whether Google Cars or its like are going to come in. It's pretty likely, but what is very likely indeed is that what has been happening in the last few years won't keep on happening forever.
Yeah, I think, again, it's going through the piece that HS2 Ltd don't seem to compare like with like. When the Department for Transport is saying, well, this is how much rail growth is increasing, they're looking at national rail growth, and they're conveniently not paying attention to long-distance travel, whichever of the 3 definitions for long-distance travel you use. And you've seen that that growth in long-distance travel has completely bottomed out over the last 4 years. It's been on a consistent decline. It's now under 1%. And the easiest way of looking and thinking, are HS2 Ltd's demand forecasts reasonable, is the fact that the demand forecasts seem to think that HS2 will be full the moment it is built, which seems to me completely absurd. And the reality is that while rail use is increasing, 70% of rail journeys in this country are London and the South East. And that's the reality, that the majority of passengers on the rail network are short-distance commuters. They are not the long-distance, point-to-point business users. And the reality is, again, that the growth in rail travel has been predominantly based on the growth in discounted tickets, advanced tickets, and being able to get the long distances, at least in the long distance terms, somewhere cheaper than you would otherwise be able to do so. And of course, HS2 Ltd and the department have consistently ignored other ways to increase capacity, including the ones that are planned, such as bringing in ETRMS, which is automatic signalling, so you will be able to increase the number of trains and potentially the speed of the trains on the existing tracks.
Thank you.
The Department of Transport, as you surely know, attempted to address the issues you've raised, specifically aspects that you feel should have been given more attention to, the cost of capital, the cost of connecting to existing infrastructure, and the cost beyond 2036. And as I read the Department of Transport's reply, I feel they've been pretty sensible in what they've said, but I would welcome if you could care to expand on that a little bit. And when I say expand, I don't mean to be impolite, but you're not getting a very high grade for being as concise as the chairman asked initially.
I'll try and do better. Perhaps I can try and change your mind on the position at Euston. I'm basically, at Euston, we're in a position where the means of getting away from Euston mainline station and into mainline station are pretty busy already. And I think pretty well everybody accepts that if you had the extra volume of passengers that HS2 would bring, it wouldn't work. Now, you're in a situation where reinforcing the infrastructure at Euston so that you have something like Crossrail 2 is not an optional extra. You will not get the journey time savings that HS2 claim if you are in the situation you haven't relieved the dispersal from Euston. So saying, okay, that's another business, it has its own benefits, it simply isn't true. You will not get the core benefits if you don't address the problem. And it isn't a problem you can solve for nothing. So there's a large cost there that ought to be in their calculations, and it isn't.
Yeah, I think probably one of the best examples of this is looking at the East Midlands station at Towton, assuming it's going to be at Towton. Obviously, there's the rumour going around that it's going to get moved to Breaston, but obviously the business case and the figures that we have at the moment are based at Towton. Now, HS2 Ltd are telling you that it will take 51 minutes to get from London to Towton, and then it will take a further 17 minutes, so 68 minutes in total, to get to the centre of Nottingham. At the moment, there is no way of doing that at all. It will take you 40 minutes on a bus, it will take you 30 minutes on driving. Even if they extend the tram network, the chance of doing it in 17 minutes are minimal. However, the business case relies on the idea that you can get to the centre of Nottingham in 68 minutes, and the infrastructure is not in place to do that. They say it will take 22 minutes to get to Derby, and when we've asked them, well, how are you going to do that? They say, oh, well, you just get a cab. Which seems, again, bizarre. And it's these things that need to be in the business case to make this, that need to be included in the cost to make this thing work, that have been excluded. Because HS2 Ltd are very good at saying, well, this is the time it currently takes you to get to Birmingham, this is the time it will take you to get to Birmingham. But it's not getting you to New Street, it's getting you to Curzon Street, which is, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes walk to New Street. And the thing is that it's shown across the world that the advantages in getting a higher speed train are completely lost if you cannot easily continue your onward journey. And as things stand, out of the 10 proposed stations, only 2 of them are at current station sites, Euston and Manchester Piccadilly. All the rest of them will be new builds. Obviously, Old Oak Common is a bit of a a bit of a different one because there will be a station for Crossrail, but only as a result of HS2. Crossrail is not building a station at Old Oak Common. But this is the thing, that you will have to lose the time that you have saved to continue your onward journey. And HS2 Ltd.
Interrupt you to say,
yes, of course.
putting it another way, and my favourite country to visit is Japan. The transport systems there make us look medieval. Are you really entirely satisfied? I mean, you do give me the impression that you're looking for reasons not to like this. I mean, what is your feeling about the future of rail transport in Britain? You're happy with it as it is?
Well, I think the answer to that is
No,
that,
I've gone off piste.
is that virtually nobody is happy with it as it is. But I think, if you a really nice example of the sort of thing that people are considering that they think they might get some benefit out of is actually HS3. Now, HS3, I think the naming is actually quite important here, because I think it's about detoxifying the high-speed brand. Because when you look at it, it is high speed. It goes 125 miles an hour, which is defined in the European standard as high speed for an uprated rail. We've actually got plenty of that. It's not the ultra-fast speed you get with that high speed 2, which we contend isn't suited for a small, densely populated country. But the great thing about high speed 3 is it wouldn't have a tendency to draw economic benefit down to London, which is clearly a risk with HS2. But more interestingly yet, they don't call West Coast Main Line Virgin Services High Speed 0 or East Coast Main Line High Speed -1, but they are, by this definition, high-speed railways. A very important point to understand about our railway system is that we have a very developed network. We have fast, frequent services to the major destinations of our country. In fact, if you look back to Eddington, one of the reasons that they thought that high-speed rail would not be a priority for the UK is because we already had faster connections to our major cities from the capital than the places that were going for high-speed rail.
Yeah, I suppose that the easiest way to demonstrate the problem with HS2 is simply quoting the title of David Higgins' report last week, Beyond HS2 Towards a National Rail Strategy. And that's the problem with HS2. There should have been a national rail strategy first, and maybe HS2 would have come out of that process, but it didn't. And that's the problem throughout this, is that HS2 has been chosen as a project in isolation, and I'll get on to HS3 later, I suspect, but it's been chosen as a project in isolation without actually looking at what the country needs. For example, one of the arguments that we keep get thrown at us is that the West Coast Main Line will be full to bursting in not very long. The reality, I suppose I'm touching on the next question, the reality is that there are ways around that. For example, until the West Coast Main Line was electrified in the 60s, you used to have trains coming down from Birmingham, down the Chiltern line into Paddington. And with Crossrail capacity, releasing capacity at Paddington, or even the new North London line into Old Oak Common, being able to divert trains into there, that may be a strategic alternative, which has been completely ignored. And that's a problem, that all the strategic alternatives have been ignored to this to HS2, simply because, as Eddington warned, it is a policy which has allowed political momentum to build up behind it, making it unpopular or difficult to cancel. And that's where we are, really, that this decision has been made into isolation. Going back to the original question of the missing costs, it's not just the additional infrastructure, which the HS3 proposal is a tacit admission that this is actually needed to make the thing work. But you've got to look at other issues. And one of the best ones, I suppose, is the disruption during during construction, because the alternatives were dismissed by a Network Rail report saying that you would have all this disruption on the existing rail network, saying 14 years of weekend closures, completely ignoring that on the Great Western Line with electrification there, they're doing it at night and avoiding that disruption and forgetting that you could do that with other places. But HS2 Ltd completely ignored the disruption that HS2 will cause, even in the rail basis, because you've got 15 years potential reconstruction of Euston. You have to move every track and every platform. Obviously, the official timescale is 10 years, but the discussions that seem to be coming out of Camden at the moment are pointing towards 15 years. That is going to cause massive disruption for everywhere that has trains coming into Euston. You've also got to look at where it crosses the West Coast Main Line at Lichfield, at Balsall Common, other places on the network, such as the fact that as soon as Crossrail is built, you'll be messing it up by building a station right in the middle of it, which isn't exactly going to help. The same with the East-West line. And all of these things have been ignored, as have, more importantly, potentially to the economy, the disruption that this is going to mean to the roads. For example, near the Birmingham Interchange Station, which is a good mile away from the current Birmingham International Station, you've got to cross 2 dual carriageways, one of which is actually 4 lanes at that point, and 2 motorways, and build a station in the space of 2 miles. Now, there's a phrase for that: years of traffic chaos. HS2 want to move the M1 in 2 places, and this needs monetarising in the business case, and it simply hasn't been at all. It's part of our optimism bias, is the answer that you'll get out of HS2 Ltd. And finally, of course, we're supposed to be facing fuel shortages. We have no idea where the electricity is going to come for this thing. When we ask that question, we get told, well, we're the Department for Transport, it's not our problem.
Yes, gentlemen. When David Prout appeared before us last week, he described the number of seats available on long-distance services out of Euston as a problem. Do you disagree that it's a problem?
Well, obviously, there's a need for capacity throughout the network, but one of the great examples I could give you is that last year, supposedly the busiest train, the most overcrowded train in the country, was the 446 out of Euston to Crewe. The reason that it was the most crowded train in the country was that it was 4 carriages long. Now it's 8 carriages long, and all of a sudden it is not the most crowded train in the country. And this is a problem with the trains coming out of Euston that are over capacity. It's not the Virgin trains, it's not the long distance trains in the main, it's the London Midland trains, the short distance commuting trains, places going to Hemel Hempstead, Watford Junction, Tring, Milton Keynes, etc., etc. And you'll find that those are the problems, and in a lot of cases you can simply extend those trains. The other thing that's come out recently is that HS2 Ltd have finally realised how much disruption the plans to redevelop Euston would cause, and they're talking about the potential, and obviously there's the problem between one being on AC and one being on DC, but they're talking about potentially running the aforementioned London Midland trains, or at least to those destinations such as Tring and Hemel, along Crossrail and out at Old Oak Common via, let's say, the new North London line onto the West Coast Main Line. Now, that's potentially something which will alleviate that problem in some extent, but as I mentioned before, you previously had trains coming into Birmingham that were going down the Chiltern line into Paddington. Obviously they go into Marylebone at the moment, but you have the potential to run those into Old Oak Common as well. And these are strategic ways of trying to address the problem, which have not been looked at. And the reality is that the West Coast Main Line, Euston, is, out of all the London termini, the second least busy station. Out of all those termini, the least busy is St Pancras, where HS1 arrives. So, although you're potentially addressing a problem, you're not addressing where the problem actually really lies and where capital spending should be prioritised.
If I can try and more directly answer the question, the government has persistently said that the long-distance trains out of Euston are full and there's a capacity problem with them. That simply isn't true. We knew it wasn't true, but we had tremendous difficulty getting the facts out of the government. They wouldn't release the passenger counts information. And actually we ended up commissioning our own study and counting the number of people on the trains. And it proved to be quite a good study, because eventually the government had to release the information because the court told them to. And it confirmed that trains leaving Euston in the evening peak are just over half full. Now, if you're trying to make a case for HS2, that's a very inconvenient fact. I can see why you wouldn't want everybody to know that the trains are half empty. But the simple fact is that the evidence shows that the long distance trains, even in peak, are a little over half full.
The issue of increasing capacity, how would you address that? There's been a few proposals put forward from the 51M local authorities to GB Freight that would link the Channel Tunnel to Glasgow, to the New Economics Foundation, £33 billion investment for Eastern Coast, West Coast Main Line.
In the longer term, if the model for predicting rail passenger growth is right, you will end up having more demand on the West Coast Main Line than the current arrangements can cater for. They might be a little over half empty now, but eventually that would fill up. Now, the 51M solution is, to my mind, a sensible way to go about it, because you don't have to take a view now on what demand is going to be in 2036. You've got a whole set of small responses you can make in regard to demand increasing, like lengthening the trains, like removing one or two of the pinch points so that you can get a couple more services in. It's an incremental approach which actually is capable in full form of handling all the long distance demand that the HS2 demand projections have. It doesn't handle all the demand that HS2 would, because HS2 claims this 26% uplift in demand because the journey is faster. So what they're saying is, not only will people swap over to HS2 because it costs the same and it's faster, but for every 3 passengers that you get transferring across, you'll get an extra one because it goes a bit faster. It doesn't handle the one extra, because you wouldn't have the one extra, but it handles the 3. So I think it's quite a good solution. It's a particularly good solution because you don't have to take a punt on what things are going to be in the distant future, which in reality nobody knows.
I don't think I've anything to add to what myself and Mr. Weston have already said.
Well, Chipley, could I just ask you, your modelling on capacity, what allowance you made for population growth?
We simply took the demand forecasts that DFT and HS2 had made. We didn't make our own forecasts. We just demonstrated that all that demand could be accommodated. So, but certainly within their modelling, they have increases in population growth. They have increases in productivity and per capita income. They have a whole host of factors which are built in there, and certainly population growth is one of them. But of course, population growth is gives you about 1/5 of the increase that you get from the supposedly conservative 2.2% per annum compound growth. So, the population is very, very easily accommodated.
Okay. So can I just go back to an issue that we were discussing a while ago on the fare structure and premium fares. Now, I had always assumed that HS2 would charge premium fares. Okay. However, the modelling is done on the expectation that they're the same, should the operator be permitted, be able to charge premium fares, first of all?
I think it's absolutely certain that that would happen, because you cannot have a situation whereby you are running two trains, one is much faster than the other, and they're both the same price. Just look at, say, Birmingham to London at the moment. You have three options. You have the London Midland, which is a very slow train. You have the Chiltern Line, which is the medium train. And you have the Virgin, which is a fast train. And the price bands reflect those speeds. It's that simple. It's very obvious that all that's happened is that HS2 Ltd and the Department of Transport have said, we're going to look at the same prices because that's the only way we can make the business model work. Because they're effectively assuming that almost everyone is going to transfer from the West Coast Main Line to HS2. And all you have to do is look at Kent, and it's quite simple. You can do the same journey on the Javelin as you can do on the South East trains, and one costs more than the other, and it's pretty straightforward. That's what the case will be if HS2 were to open.
Okay. So are you concerned about the extent to which HS2 is reliant on public subsidy, whether premium fares are charged or are not charged?
Well, it's not just a question of, it's not just a question of whether or not premium fares will be charged or not. It's a question of whether or not the passenger forecasting is robust, which we would say it's not. And as a result, I would say there's absolutely no question that HS2 would require a very large public subsidy. All you have to do is, you can look across the world, and wherever you look at high-speed rail networks, you find that they never manage to attract the grossly inflated passenger numbers which were used to justify their construction. And the best example, obviously, I could give you is HS1 in Kent, which was genuinely a brand new rail link because you couldn't get a train under the sea before, and that they were celebrating just this year arriving at 10 million passengers per year, but they should be at 25.
Right. So what level of subsidy do you think is likely to occur?
A massive one, unfortunately.
Can you quantify that?
You can't really speculate.
I
find it very difficult to speculate on it because obviously it would depend on where the fares ended up in the future, which we can't really tell.
But you
and
think
of course,
it would be massive? You've used
absolutely,
that word.
Absolutely.
Massive.
Absolutely, because what HS2 Ltd are relying on is basically a doubling in passenger numbers by 2033. Right. And and how they come to their benefit cost ratio is by multiplying 3 or 4 very large numbers by each other to end up with a massive number at the end. Right. Now, if one of those large numbers is a bit smaller, then it puts a massive hole in your business case.
If I can just add one point, I think there's an implication in the question that if you had premium pricing, somehow or other you wouldn't have to face the same subsidy. I don't know if that was intended, but if it were, I think the problem with that view is that if you have premium pricing, what that means is a lot of people would choose not to move off the classic services. It means that you wouldn't be able to cut the classic services in the same sort of way, so you wouldn't be able to have the 8 billion odd saving from doing that. You'd find yourself with loads of capacity, which you'd be running, and you'd probably be in a situation where you'd have a large ongoing running cost subsidy. So not only do you have to stash out to build the thing in the first place out of public money, you then are in a situation where you have a year-on-year drain on finance because it's not a paying concern.
Okay.
If we assume that the purpose of all this, however you achieve it, whether it's HS2 or whether it's improvements to the existing rail network or indeed other solutions which are possible, is the purpose of it is to connect Birmingham initially, but then Manchester, Leeds and so on, and presumably eventually Glasgow and what have you, better to London and to the southeast, which the government is saying that this would have major economic benefits in rebalancing the economy. In other words, it would boost the economy in Birmingham initially, but eventually as the HS2 reaches Manchester, it would boost the whole of the north west and eventually the northeast as well.
Do you buy that argument?
I don't buy it at all. I mean, the interesting thing is, although this argument has been run for quite a while now, it started from a position of really there being no evidence for it at all. And the difficulty that you have is that a better connection to London most naturally reinforces the dominance of London. If you look at it narrowly, there's sort of 4 reasons. Old Oak Common was identified as the best opportunity for regeneration. HS2 may well support more economic divergence because it may make it possible to operate with just having an office in London and not having one up north. It's very hard to see how any of this is overcoming the fact that we are very London-centric, that the main transport routes are radial from London, so that actually improving one of the spokes in this doesn't put the far end from London of the spoke in the same situations as London, because the rest of the links to the country aren't there. It isn't removing London's sort of historically established advantage. On a narrow level, the extra passengers that HS2 is supposed to carry, a lot of them are going to be leisure passengers, and on the DFT's own numbers, most of them will be making trips to London. And they'd be making trips to London, and they'd be spending money in London they would have spent further north. And finally, if you solve the passenger dispersal problem from Weston this is going to create, for example, by building Crossrail 2, that's another benefit for London.
Quite honestly, if you wanted to wave the magic wand and rebalance the economy, the very last thing you would want to do is make it easier for people to come to London, because this is, again, when you look at the international comparisons, you find that more economic activity gets sucked to the capital, and with London being so primate in our economy, the effects are far likely to be much worse in this country than they have been in other countries. I suppose one of the best examples you could have is David Higgins, again, a tacit admission that HS2 is about solving London's commuter problem, is that he said without it at the weekend in the Sunday Times, last weekend in the Sunday Times, that without HS2 you'd need a massive house building programme in the southeast. Now, if that isn't saying it's about commuting, I don't know what is, and this is what you've got to expect. You've got to expect, commuter towns to be built south of Crewe, somewhere between Nottingham and Derby, between Coventry and Birmingham. You've actually already got the first plans for a garden city as a result of the station near Birmingham Airport, submitted by Solihull Borough Council at the moment. So if that doesn't really demonstrate that it's about getting more people into London, I really don't know what is.
So, just because I'm sort of struggling with the concept of what you're saying, the logical conclusion from what you're saying is that we shouldn't spend any money on improving communications between Birmingham and London, because all that does is benefit London and to the detriment of Birmingham. And so you shouldn't actually improve transport facilities north-south in the UK at all. In fact, you might even argue that, carrying your possibly to absurdity, but you should actually argue that you'd actually make them worse, because that would boost the economy in Manchester more.
No, what areas like Birmingham really need is money spent in those areas themselves. North-south links are pretty good as they are, to be perfectly honest. What's bad is east-west and interurban transport systems. Now, if you could, you look at, for example, Leeds. Leeds is the largest city in Western Europe without a light rail solution. And if you could promise that to Leeds, would they still support HS2 so much? The reality is that it doesn't matter where you look, you will drag more economic activity to London if you make it faster to go to London. I know the committee's mentioned that the Doncaster paradox previously, in that if fast connection to London meant economic activity, Doncaster would be one of the richest places in the country. The same reason that David Higgins is saying that making Crewe a rail hub will make it prosperous. Being a rail hub is the only reason Crewe's there in the first place. And they're talking about more jobs being created in Crewe than their current population. Now, when you look at these figures in depth, they seem patently absurd.
Thank you. Well, you referred to it actually, Mr. Rukin, right at the beginning. The east-west connection, which obviously has been coming up all the time. And in fact, the last few days, Sir David Higgins has reported as saying that it's not only desirable but possible, etc., etc. Is it could it be a standalone project, in your opinion?
I think that the problem is with HS3, as it is proposed at the moment, is like HS2, a decision seems to have made in isolation, and the government seems to have gone for the highest cost option without really assessing the alternatives. We've said since the start that if you want to rebalance the economy and create, well, as is now dubbed, a northern powerhouse, you spend the money there, as I said with the example with Leeds. But again, there needs to be a strategy first, an analysis of what is needed. For example, Arup reported just this year that you could reintroduce, effectively create a new Transpennine link by reintroducing 11 miles of lost track between Skipton and Colne. Now, that isn't the perfect commuter route between Manchester and Leeds, but it would potentially move freight onto that line, and that could be done for £110 million compared to the $7 billion that you're talking about with HS2. You could probably chuck in, the Woodhead line from Sheffield to Manchester and still have and still be paying about 500 million. There's other places like Beverley to York, and numerous examples of places where you could reintroduce old track. In Skipton to Colne, you could actually do it 4 track for 110 million. But these things don't seem to have been looked at. And the very odd thing I find with this HS3 argument is where it leaves the current plan for Transpennine electrification, because it seems that these plans don't necessarily work in isolation, because the HS3 plan, as it's been called, is clearly about, in the main, updating existing tracks, because, as Mr. Weston indicated, if you're travelling at 125 miles an hour and you're calling it high speed, that means it's an upgraded track. It doesn't mean it's a new build. Maybe you have a section of tunnel which will be new build, but it has to be upgrading track, because you can't call it high speed if it's new unless it's going 155 miles an hour. So where it leaves the current Transpennine electrification, we don't know, and that's worrying in some parts, because just again earlier this year, Network Rail were at the Transport Select Committee in the Commons and said that they could guarantee doing Manchester to Liverpool, but they couldn't guarantee doing Manchester beyond, because there was never any real budget for the Transpennine electrification. And that's the real question. Where is this money coming from? And there were a lot of other things that came out of the HS3 conversations. Well, the Prime Minister said he was starting a conversation last week when the Chancellor said he was starting the same conversation back in June, so very little seems to have happened since then. But the thing with that is it's really not sure, we're really not sure what the absolute purpose is, because you're talking about spending £7 billion just to reduce journey times between Manchester and Leeds. Now, if you're doing that, and it's about reducing journey times, then you've got the potential that you're actually reducing the services of the intermediate points between Manchester and Leeds, because besides improving the speed on the track, the other way that you cut journey times is by cutting out stops as well. And again, it's this whole problem that the north does not consist of Manchester city centre and Leeds city centre. There are lots of places, the north's hardly started by the time you get to Manchester. And it's about, if you really want to rebalance the economy, you have to invest in these inter-urban and inter-regional systems which deliver more benefits to more people more quickly and cost a lot less money.
Yes. Do you have a comment on that, Mr.
The only observation I'd make is that I think I'd probably go along with Professor Overman, who addressed you on this earlier, who suggested that if your priority is regeneration, then intra-urban investments are likely to be the better bet.
May I then just, in conclusion, ask this question? So, HS3, is your opinion, is as useless to us as HS2. And you've been quoted as saying £175 million a mile, I believe.
Yes. Well, the Prime.
So no, excuse me. So, well, what is your solution?
Well, our solution is to, as I said at the start, to actually start with a position of developing a strategy, not developing a policy. 175 million per mile comes from the Prime Minister's own figures, 7 billion for 40 miles. And that seems rather odd because that was achieved by saying, well, if it's going to cost the same amount of HS2 does per mile, or HS2 only costs about 122 million per mile, or 143 if you include the trains. So it's not that HS3 as a concept is a bad idea, it's that it's being done without really looking at the consequences. Basically, it seems to be perfectly honest. It's something that's been announced just before the election, very much like HS2 was back in 2010, without any real justification for what it's about.
Mr. Weston, you have anything?
If I could just throw in one thought, which is that if you're looking for a transport solution to rebalance the economy, you're probably looking in the wrong place. It's completely ignoring the problems you have with skills.
Okay, thank you.
Lawson.
We're running out of time, so I'll just ask one very brief question. Perhaps you give a very brief answer. And if the answer is nothing, that's fine. But you've obviously been paying attention to the previous hearings that we've had in this inquiry. Is there anything you think that we've overlooked? Is there any point which we need to address which has not so far come up?
I think some of the previous witnesses have not been certain on the validity of looking at international comparisons. However, I think that may be something that you'd like to spend a little time on. Like, just last week we had the Mayor of Calais in front of a select committee giving evidence with a translator. And it's clear that the French have been paying attention to us because the Cour de Comp, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, actually referred to a National Audit Office report in a recent report they did on the TGV, where again they said the problem with the TGV was over-optimistic passenger numbers, it was a worn-out business model irrelevant today, it was incoherent assessment of the socio-economic impact. It was very similar to the arguments that we're making about HS2, but something that's 40 years down the line. And the other thing they said was that there were unsustainable costs. So very much in key with what we've been saying, and I would suggest that it would be useful potentially getting some input from international comparisons.
If I could make just one point, which is that there's been very little discussion of the issue of how you assess the benefits of HS2. That is the comparator. And what has been used is a do minimum solution that is less than a do minimum, and it has some very odd properties that grossly exaggerate the benefits you ascribe to HS2. For example, it assumes a set for those projects which are already committed, you effectively have like-for-like replacements in perpetuity, because it's not assuming any improvements in capacity or journey times or energy consumption or anything else that you get pretty well for free when you have a renewal. And using this do minimum might be okay for a short-term project for improving a roundabout, which takes a couple of years. But when you're looking over the sorts of timescales that HS2 is involved in, to operate with the do minimum where you're simply ignoring what will happen anyway, and you're assessing the benefits on the basis of a do minimum that isn't capable of handling the demand. So you get a big plus for reducing crowding. Not crowding that ever really exists, it's crowding which is a creation of the way that you've modelled the improvements. So I think one of the things that really does merit looking at is the do minimum basis against which HS2 is assessed, instead of either a proper do minimum or indeed, I think best practice would dictate, you actually look at the best alternative. And okay, it might be quite difficult to do that because the great thing about the do minimum they have is it's mechanical, but it just gives you the wrong answer.
Thank you very much indeed. Very helpful answers.